And to help us explore this a little bit further, I'm joined in studio now by Professor Pitikantuli. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you to the viewers.
And you're an academic. This is something that's very close to your heart, and we'll explore this from an academic viewpoint, but also from a personal viewpoint and your experiences. And another young person who's in studio is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here. With
and you as well, too come, as we look at your colour, people will say, here's a coloured mensa, you know, and I guess that also is an identity that you've had to explore yourself, being biracial, white mom, black dad. Okay, so let's start with that, because we've just seen Jonathan Butler.
Sure.
He had to deal with the issue. It's Heritage Day in South Africa, and one category is coloured. How do you relate to that as an identity?
Well, I think the interesting thing to realise, and something that I've grappled with, and I think a lot of South Africans grapple with, is we've inherited a number of identities through our apartheid past. And I think where we find ourselves as a country now is both struggling against those identities and trying to create new identities for ourselves. But that raises an interesting tension, because it's one thing how you see yourself. And I see myself, in fact, I self-identify as black. But, you know, I deal with my identity in many different ways. But that doesn't mean that other people see me as I see myself. And so often I am greeted as if in South Africa I'm coloured.
But if you embrace blackness, does that not exclude your mother and an aspect of who you are?
Well, I think I understand the historical position that I come into in South Africa. When I was born, which was still during apartheid, if you weren't white in South Africa, you were black. And I think I grew up with the knowledge of being proud of being black. And my parents impressed upon me the importance of owning that identity instead of trying to run away from it. I certainly still draw from my mother's identity. In fact, the funny thing is sometimes I think in South Africa still whiteness offers you advantages that blackness doesn't, and that's a very sad part, and I think my unique identity shows me that. But I think South Africans, and particularly young South Africans, need to own their black identity and feel proud of it, and I certainly am someone who does that at a political level.
Okay, Prof, what on earth is identity? Because this is probably where this conversation really should have started. How do we even define this thing? I mean, is it something that's thrust upon us? Is it something that we're born into and that's who you are, Namakanjan? Or is it something that kind of evolves or we choose to be?
I think, Peter, the poet in me overthrows the academic for this moment. I'll start with a poem. First, they said we were natives. They placed us in native reserves under the Department of Native Affairs. When they learned that native meant we owned the land, they changed. Then they called us Bantu under the Department of Bantu Affairs. When they learned that Bantu meant we were the people, they changed. Then they called us plurals. Under the Department of Plural Affairs, our revolution became singular. Then they changed. They called us cooperatives. Under the Department of Cooperative Affairs, we cooperated to form United France. How could we be defeated? So whether we choose our own identities, there's always somebody who's going to want to impose a particular identity on us. Better to position, fix, and control.
All right, so it's 2013, 1994. I mean, I was around here. I'm an immigrant, and that's another whole conversation. But I've seen South Africa change, and the young people of today are nothing like the young people of 1994. Is there a new identity, perhaps, that is South African that's developing? And I'm going to ask you that as well, Sizwe.
I think there is an identity that and it is. I've got a son like him. But the people who come into my house, they are from Zambia, India, and this. When you look at my house, you wouldn't say it's a mixed house. It has become, in a sense, a world. And they loving each other. We've been to a wedding, a traditional wedding, where one of the white friends was marrying somebody from Venda. And the language that actually comes in is a totally different one, another identity of the language this time.
All right. Okay. So, Caesar, a quick comment from you, because then after this, I'm going to be going to the streets. We're going to ask Ayanda to introduce to us to some boxers. But just before we go there, a quick thought on what we've just said now.
Look, I think there are pockets of integration, but I'm worried that often our identities are still defined as they were in the past, and it's very difficult for South Africans to get outside of those. And I think the creation of a new unifying identity is still a project that our country needs to spend some time thinking about building.
All right. Okay. So, Ayanda, this is just a few people here, a couple of people in the studio here talking about identities, but we went out in the streets, didn't we?
We did indeed, Peter, and there were a host of responses when people describe what they think heritage is, how they identify, and how they think they are, or who they think they are as South Africans. Let's take a look.
Gewoonlik is dit altyd net die soorte kos wat ons eet. In ons kulture, gewoonlik is ons aan die ander kant gaan ander mense sal hulle ander goed eet op ons braai gewoonlik. So ja, daai is ons is hier baie as 'n gesin, ons is hier meer gebind aan kultuur as gevolg van die verandering wat deesdae in die nuwe Suid-Afrika plaasvind. Is almal doen een ding saam, soos ons gaan na 'n fees toe of so. So kultuur is as meer baie kultuur is in ons gemeenskap hier, as ek dit so mag stel.
I mean, I was brought up to not really, not deny where I come from, but not let it be the number one thing in my life. It's just live my life with everybody else. So I'm very proud of where I come from, and a lot of people mistake me for a white girl, but I always make sure that they know, because I mean, I'm proud of it.
I feel that I'm just South African because I wasn't born in a Muslim country or a Malaysian country. I was born here, so I guess I fall into the coloured aspect because of my skin colour, but other than that, I'm South African overall.
In culture, we're loving kind of, we have a loving kind of feel. Yes, we do a lot of bad things, but we like to bring people together. We like to be, we like to feel a connection to someone else. And that's how we celebrate our heritage.
We don't really know who we are as yet because we're a young nation and we went through the struggles of apartheid, our parents and stuff. And we're actually confused. We don't embrace ourselves properly yet. We look to the media to see how we should act. And I feel that we need to rid of culture actually. We need to stop looking at ourselves as whites, blacks, and we South Africans, and we need to unify ourselves, and we need to become like individuals, and we shouldn't be looked as different in the eyes of the public.
Jy word gesien as 'n kleerling, maar eintlik jy's nou tussenin. Hoekom is jy tussenin? Hoekom kan ons nie vooruit stap as kleerlinge en net onsself wees nie? Hoekom kan ons jouself bou soos wit en swart en net een wees en ons is unieke mense wat ons is kleurvol?
The colored community, and I will celebrate that, is from young. My parents always told me it's about the connection, see, between all races, white, colored, black, doesn't matter. It's about family, it's the bond, and that's the heritage for me.
All right, so that's a view from young people in particular on the streets and discussing what they feel and see as their identity. And let's go back to our guests. I'm going to start with you, Sizwe, because I'm looking at these young people and a couple of them coloured, a few of them coloured. And the reality is, if I called some of those black, they would have a go at me and saying, this is my identity, this is my culture. You've chosen to call yourself black, and I'm wondering, do biracial people have a choice? Can you say he's not coloured, he's black, and can he say, no, you're not black, you're coloured?
Well, I think what's interesting is that we are in a situation in our country where the old categories don't necessarily apply. And I think because there's been integration and people have gone across racial boundaries, new categories have emerged that we need to embrace and affirm as equally legitimate as others. So when I say I'm black, that's a political decision. But if I was to say I was mixed race, then I think we need to get to the point in South Africa where we realize that that in itself is a category. And there may be many other categories. And as we go forward into the future, hopefully if South Africa comes together, then the old categories will start to matter less.
All right, so you are, I suppose, what they call first-generation biracial mixed race.
We're taking over
because
the world,
you've got a black
Obama.
dad, white mom. What happens to the second layer where both parents are coloured, biracial? Does the identity take on a slightly different slant?
I think it does. I think it takes on a new complexity, and yet again another category is created. And then I think that's a positive thing, because we then start living in a country where we don't put people into 5 categories and only 5, but we start seeing the complexity of their humanity, the complexity of their identity, and confronting that head on, as opposed to confronting it in a way that we did in the past.
Okay, so that's a biracial question. I'm going to ask you one, because I know you've got a white wife. When you got married, they say the two shall become one. So you're a black man, and I'm wondering how much of your identity has shifted by choosing a partner of a different race?
Sorry, I think our colonial education made us very, very good English people. So it's not an accident that my wife is a middle-class English woman. But then we had to negotiate. That her culture had dominated us. So how much is she going to take to do so? So when we came back here and wanted to renew our vows, I was dressed as a complete Khoisan man. She was dressed with the whole Ndebele thing, beads and all, sitting in the corner of a house, holding a broom. Because we just actually realized that we have got to keep on ceaselessly reinventing ourselves. That's what identities are, because identities are multiple. And you pick them up and you use your identity wherever you are. In the beginning, you said I was an intellectual, an academic. That's just one, that whenever I go, people are going to think that. But I chose that I'm a poet. That's another identity. I can stop and say I'm just a poet, but I'm an African poet, and I'm a South African poet. It becomes more complex, doesn't it?
Okay, let's explore something else now. We've talked about biracial identities and so on and so forth, but now we've got someone who knows is black, both parents are black, but perhaps one is Xhosa, one is Sotho. What do we do with that identity? Culturally, I suppose we follow the father's line, but that really doesn't tell the whole story, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, today now you're going to have Tsepo Mahlangu, you are going to have, Mandla, Lirato, Musia, But again, what happens is that, culturally, black people, there are certain commonalities. It's only when we quarrel with each other that then the stereotypes, start, kind of emerging.
All right, so Sizwe, I want to ask you about your experience, because you went through a Xhosa initiation, and I wonder, did that make you embrace that identity all the more?
Absolutely. I mean, as I say, in South Africa, particularly as a mixed-race South African, one's sometimes drawn to the advantages that one's whiteness, so to speak, gives one. To the detriment of other cultures. But I think having spent a year in the rural areas and undergoing the Xhosa initiation, one realizes the depth that exists in many of our African cultures in South Africa. And I think we need to embrace that. I think we need to understand that. And I still think in South Africa, often African cultures are an afterthought. The dominant language continues to be English. The dominant culture continues to be middle-class European culture. And we need to find a way of bringing in all our different cultures so that they intermingle as opposed to rest separately.
Prof, I come originally from Zimbabwe, even though I was born in exile in Zambia, grew up in Europe, etc., etc. But when you ask Africans beyond South Africa, where are you from, they will never give you the name of a city. They will give you the name of some rural town or some rural area. South Africa is a slightly different scenario, where we had the townships that were created years and years and years ago. And there are some children who that is all they've known for a generation. Is that now an identity in itself? Because they can't point, some of them, to some rural setting where ancestors come from.
Yeah, I think it's an identity. When you ask somebody and somebody says, I'm from a township,
yeah.
Do you know? That township in itself represents a particular culture, a particular sort of resistance and how those people resisted. So when you say I'm from New Brighton, now we are different from somebody who is from Cape Town or anywhere. So that if the townships, actually themselves, the locations, as they call them, locate you and your culture, your ideas and your philosophies in a particular time frame that you continue with you as long as you live.
So now what do we do with our elders? Because they'll look at these young people and say, you're losing your culture, you're losing your traditions. Or should we be saying, we've got a different layer and different ways of expressing now, and is it evolving? I mean, what do you do?
Yeah. I mean, how often do we hear people saying this is a lost generation, isn't it? Now, when I look at the lost generation, most of the time, this lost generation are our children. We never ask ourselves the question, how did we lose this generation? And because our education in itself is a photocopy of Western education, our orientation is Western, the language is Western. So we have thoroughly lost a generation, of our own kind of an age group. So the issue that you brought up of language, language is a carrier of values, is a carrier of philosophies. You take a language from a person you have destroyed. Just one quick example. You take a word in Zulu, ulwazi. That's one word, ulwa, you fight, z, knowing. Knowledge means is that which is worth fighting for, which is worth defending. From one word. And if at all you don't understand that, how many words in a language and how much are we suppressing?
Sizwe, we're just going to find out about perhaps one group that, many people look at, perhaps one of the oldest in this particular region. Let's go to Ayanda and meet who these people are, and then we'll discuss a little bit further about their role.
That's right, Peter. You're talking about the Khoisan people. And let's not forget that in our coat of arms as well, the motto that we have there, that diverse people unite, it comes from the Khoisan. So let's not forget about this group of people. And heritage plays a very pivotal role in the lives of Khoisan people, especially those living in the Platfontein area in the Northern Cape. Living heritage, things like storytelling, songs and dance, healing dances are very important to them as well. We have a package, an insert that shows exactly what I'm talking about, and I think that will put it into perspective. Let's take a look. Two San communities reside in Platfontein. They originate from Angola and Namibia. The Khwe community speaks Khwedam, while the Klu speak Klu. Despite being a proud people, some say their heritage and language is sometimes frowned upon.
Yeah, the thing that makes me proud is that we as a San people, we know our traditional things and we believe in it.
The
other San people have lost their traditions and don't know their language. I personally can speak my language and know my traditional dance. Meanwhile, contrary to popular belief, young people in this community are not abandoning their roots. The Khoisan community moved to South Africa after Namibia's independence in 1990. 23 years later, they are still jealously guarding their heritage. Margaret Mutibi, SABC News, Platfontein in the Northern Cape.
All right, very fascinating. Perhaps let's just get your thoughts. Looking at the Khoisan, they say that they're the oldest and that the true identity of South Africa resides with them. And it is another identity, perhaps one that's diminishing over time, sadly. Language is disappearing. If the language goes, does that mean the identity goes?
Yeah, I think inevitably, once a language actually goes, the identity goes, because a language is also one of the very key elements of it, because it defines who you are. It defines where you come from. It defines how you got to be where you are and where you think and plan of going. That's why the whole language heritage, in itself, is a topic actually on its own and a very volatile one.
So, Sizwe, language.
Yeah.
it's the moment you say you're South African and we look at you, there's going to be an assumption that you must praat die taal. How do you deal with that? Because there's an expectation that coloured people speak Afrikaans.
Yeah, I think often I get greeted and someone will say goeiemôre, and sometimes I'll say goeiemôre, sometimes I'll say ninjan, nam diaphila, ninjan men.
Okay.
And sometimes I'll greet back in English. I think, again, it speaks to the fact that we're so consumed with the identities that we've inherited that we haven't spent enough time creating the identities that we need to move forward with. And I think an important point for young South Africans is also on Heritage Day to be critical of our cultures as well, to be critical of racial identities, to be critical even of our own cultures, and say, look, I think I agree with this part, but even though my parents have explained it to me, I've never quite understood this part. And then to each of us come up with an identity that we think means something to us that can take us forward in our own lives.
So you're suggesting that we chop off little bits that don't work for us anymore in the modern setting and start to embrace what we think is what we would like to define ourselves going forward?
Absolutely. I wouldn't say chop off little bits and discard them consciously, but I'd say be critical of culture. And I'm a firm believer of the fact that you can never have too many cultures to learn from. And if there's something interesting to learn in your life from something that you haven't been exposed to and a way of viewing the world that a group of people have viewed it as, what's to stop you from taking the positives of that? And also what's to stop you from saying, in fact, I'm not sure I agree with that, and I'd prefer to go against that. And I think that mediation is something that we all have to deal with in a country as complex as South Africa.
Prof, we're running out of time. How do we move forward? How do we, in 20 years' time, when we celebrate Heritage Day, what would you like to see as South Africa's identity?
Yeah, I think first we have to look at it that, culture is to tradition. What politics is to history. Right? So whatever cultural things that we are changing now are going to become a kind of a tradition. But culture, by its very nature, is dynamic. It is changing. So you cannot be, who you are. So you might find that 20 years, from now, these and the Obamas, they are the ones that are taking, they are the only ones that are now taking over the world. And of course, in physics, they say when two lines that are totally different meet and interact and communicate each other, that's the best possible position in which you should find yourself. So being involved again, interracially, places you in a position where you develop a double-headedness, a double kind of a consciousness that makes you live at the height, at the edge of knowing and becoming.
When I think of Brazil, and this is the very last thought, when I think of Brazil, I see this melting pot of all these different cultures, and they're all Brazilian. Do you think that we will get to a point where there's a single South African identity that's come through and with strands of different backgrounds coming through?
I hope so, but I think it has to be consciously created. And I think on Heritage Day, we often think about what we've inherited from the past and our past identities. I think we need to think about what's our future South African identity, and despite all our differences, what unites us as South African.
All right.
It's like this. When you want to understand how good South Africans are, I'll give you an example. One will say, where is Peter? A South African will say, I definitely don't know where Peter is, but I'm sure he's at work. Now, is he still a very good interviewer? Oh, this time now, yes. No, serious. Is he still handsome? Shame, he's handsome. So you can see how we change even the words.
We're running out of time, and we've got to go to a commercial break, so I'm going to leave it there for the time being. But Peter's definitely at work on Heritage Day. We'll be back after this.